The fog came before the man did. It rolled in low across Blackwood Valley just after 5 in the evening, swallowing the tree line, swallowing the fence posts, swallowing the last pale light of an October sun that had never really committed to shining that day. Miriam Vance stood in the doorway of the main barn and watched it come the way she had learned to watch everything on this land, with patience, with caution, and with the particular stillness of a woman who had been alone for a long time. She heard him before she saw him. Not a voice, not footsteps, just a sound like wet cloth dragging against wood, and then the low, ragged pull of breath from somewhere deep in the shadows between the hay bales, and every hair on Miriam's neck stood up at once, because in 22 years of running this ranch, nothing had ever breathed at her from the dark without her knowing exactly what it was. She reached for the lantern, and the shadows moved. Before we go any further, stay right here, because what Miriam finds in that barn tonight will change everything. Not just for her, for an entire valley that has been keeping a secret for 10 years. If you have ever done something small and kind for a stranger, something quiet and unremarkable, and had no idea that small act was about to pull you into the center of something enormous, then this story is going to feel very, very close to you. Drop your city in the comments below. Let us know you are here. And if stories like this one move you, hit that like button and subscribe, because we tell these kinds of stories every week, and this one in particular, does not end where you expect it to. Now, back to the barn, back to the shadows, back to the sound of breathing that should not have been there. Miriam Vance turned 58 in September, and she celebrated the way she celebrated most things now, alone, with a mug of black coffee and the particular sound of wind moving through the pines at the edge of the property. She had baked herself a small cornbread loaf because she had the ingredients, and because wasting food was something her body had never learned to do, even when wasting a little sentiment might have done her good. The ranch was called the Double V. Her husband Thomas had named it that, back before everything. Back before the years started stacking up like the firewood she split alone each autumn and which no one helped her carry inside. The Double V sat on 1,100 acres of Montana grassland at the northern end of Blackwood Valley, bordered on 3 sides by federal forest and on the 4th by a gravel road that connected to the county highway 8 miles east. In summer, the valley was green and cold and extraordinarily quiet. In autumn, the fog came early and stayed late, and the pines turned the color of old copper, and the cattle moved in slow dark herds across the hillside like punctuation in a sentence no one was writing anymore. Miriam managed it alone. She had 2 part-time hands who came in from town on Tuesdays and Fridays for the heavy work, fence mending, loading, the veterinary runs, but the rest of the week she was the only human being on 1,100 acres, and she had made a kind of peace with that, or something that looked like peace from the outside. Something that functioned the way peace functions when you have no real choice in the matter. The neighbors, the few that existed at these distances, regarded her with a mixture of grudging respect and a persistent, low-grade pity that she found more exhausting than any physical labor. They brought casseroles she didn't ask for. They said things like, "You're holding up so well, Miriam," in voices that suggested they were perpetually surprised by it. They referenced Thomas obliquely, carefully, the way you reference a wound you are not sure has closed. Thomas Vance had disappeared 10 years ago in October. Disappeared was the word people used because it was cleaner than the alternatives. The sheriff's report, filed and subsequently closed within 4 months, listed the cause as voluntary abandonment of domicile. Thomas Vance, the report concluded, had packed a bag and left. There was no evidence of foul play. There was no body. There was no note. What there was Miriam, standing in the kitchen at 6 in the morning when she realized his truck was gone and his boots were still on the porch, and the peculiar airless certainty settling into her chest that something was very wrong, and that no one was going to believe her. She had been right on both counts. The county had believed the report. The community had believed the report, or had chosen to, which amounts to the same thing in a place like Blackwood Valley, where choosing what to believe is sometimes the only way to keep things orderly. Some people thought Thomas had a woman somewhere. Some people thought he had debts. Some people thought Miriam had driven him off with her coldness, her stubbornness, the way she ran that ranch like a general commanding a campaign and left no room for a man to feel necessary. Miriam had heard all of it. She had absorbed all of it with the same steady expression she wore in the barn, in the cold, in the dark. a face that gave nothing away, that invited no one in, that had learned after 5 decades of living that openness costs more than it returns. She did not believe Thomas had left. She believed something had happened on this land, in the dark, in the fog, in the weeks before he disappeared, when he had been quiet in a way that was different from his ordinary quietness. A watchful kind of quiet, a frightened kind of quiet. She had tried to ask him. He had told her not to worry. He had kissed her on the forehead and told her things were fine, and she had believed him because she had been stupid with love and because she had not known then what she knew now, that there are things in quiet valleys that move very slowly and very deliberately, and by the time you see them, they are already much closer than you think. The October evening she found the man in the barn. Miriam was doing what she did every evening at 5:15, locking up. The cattle were in the south pasture for the night. The 2 barn dogs, Wick and Fletcher, were kenneled near the equipment shed. The chickens were in. The water troughs had been checked. The generator had been tested. Miriam moved through these tasks the way she moved through everything, methodically, without rushing, with a discipline she had built over years, because discipline was the only architecture that had not collapsed on her. She had one more thing to do. Check the latches on the north-facing stalls in the main barn, where the wooden frame had been warping since August, and the latch on stall 4 sometimes worked itself loose in a strong wind. She pushed open the barn door, lantern in hand, and stepped into the smell of hay and cold mud and animal warmth, and heard the breathing. Miriam did not scream. She was not, by nature or by design, a woman who screamed at things. She went still instead, the lantern held level, her eyes moving to the source of the sound with the same careful economy she applied to everything. He was between the 3rd and 4th stalls, on the ground, half hidden behind a stack of old grain sacks. She could see one hand first, pale, dirty, the knuckles scraped raw, and then as the light moved, the rest of him came forward like a photograph developing. He was a man of perhaps 50, though it was difficult to say. His face was deeply lined in the way that comes not from age but from exposure and privation, the kind of wearing that belongs to people who have spent extended time somewhere without enough light, without enough food, without enough of whatever it is that keeps the body from consuming itself. He was thin in a way that was almost architectural. You could see the structure of him through his clothes, the angles and the lengths, as if his flesh had become an afterthought. His shirt was a canvas work shirt, 2 sizes too large, stained with mud and something darker along the collar. His trousers were held at the waist by a length of baling twine. He was looking at her, not with aggression, not with the flattened, animal emptiness of someone truly lost to themselves. He was looking at her with a kind of desperate, exhausted awareness, the look of a man who understood exactly where he was and exactly how bad his situation was, and who had, somewhere in the past several hours, made the calculation that barn shadows were the best available option. Miriam's first thought, a professional and somewhat unglamorous thought, was that he had a wound. She could see it along his left forearm where the sleeve had ridden up, a deep lateral cut, not fresh, maybe 2 days old, wrapped in what had once been a strip of white fabric and was now brown with dried blood and grime. It had not been properly cleaned. From where she stood, she could smell the faint chemical sweetness that meant early infection. Her second thought was that the man had not moved, had not backed away, had not made any gesture of threat or supplication. He was simply there, in her barn, breathing, looking at her, making no sound whatsoever. She waited. He made no sound. She said, "I am not going to hurt you." He blinked. That was all. She said, "Can you speak?" Nothing. Not evasion. Nothing. His lips did not move, did not press together in the effort to form something. The silence was absolute and unambiguous, like a door that has been sealed from the inside for a very long time. Miriam looked at him for another long moment, then looked at the wound on his arm, then looked at his face again, and made a decision in the way she made all her decisions, quickly, without extensive deliberation, from whatever combination of instinct and accumulated judgment had kept her alive and functional for 58 years. She said, "Come with me. I will not call anyone." She did not know why she added that last part. She would think about it later, the specific quality of his fear when she said the word anyone, the way his eyes sharpened for just a fraction of a second, the slight involuntary movement of his body toward the shadows. Like a caught thing, like a thing that had been found before by people whose finding had not been kind. She led him around the back of the barn, across the frost-stiffened grass, to the rear porch of the main house, where the overhang kept the worst of the fog out and where there was a wooden bench and an outdoor spigot she used for the dogs. She pointed at the bench. He sat. She brought warm water in a basin, an antiseptic from the medicine cabinet, and the roll of proper bandaging she kept for animal injuries and which worked just as well on human ones. He did not flinch when she cleaned the wound, though it must have hurt, the kind of hurt that arrives in waves when old, dried damage is disturbed. He sat with his hands loose in his lap and watched her work with the focused attention of someone who has learned to observe very carefully, who has perhaps survived by observing carefully, who has perhaps had very little else to do but observe. She did not speak while she worked. He did not speak. The fog sat against the edge of the porch light, and the pines moved at the tree line, and somewhere far down the valley one of the cattle called once and was silent. When she was done, she went inside and came back with a deep bowl of beef stew that had been on the back burner since noon, and a mug of coffee with 2 spoons of sugar in it, because she had no way of knowing how he took it, and sweetness seemed like it would do no harm. She set both on the bench beside him. He looked at them, and then he looked at her, and something shifted in his face, not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude. Something older and more complex than gratitude. Something that looked like the expression a person makes when they have been in darkness for so long that a single light causes them physical difficulty. He ate. He ate slowly, deliberately, with the restraint of someone who has learned that eating too fast after going without causes its own kind of suffering. He drank the coffee with both hands around the mug. Miriam sat on the far end of the bench with her own coffee and watched the fog. She did not ask him anything. She did not require anything of him. She simply sat there in the cold, in the dark, with a stranger who could not or would not speak, and let the night do what nights do in Blackwood Valley, settle in slowly, with great quiet, and ask nothing of the people inside it. When he was finished, she showed him to the back room, a small space off the mudroom that she used for storage and which had a cot from the days when Thomas's nephew used to visit in summers. She put a wool blanket on the cot and set a lantern on the floor with the wick turned low. The man sat on the cot and looked at the blanket, and then at the lantern. Miriam said, "Sleep. We can figure out the rest in the morning." She went to her own room, locked the door, not from fear of him, exactly, but from a long habit of self-protection that had nothing to do with this specific man, and lay in the dark for a very long time before she slept, listening to the pines and the wind and the occasional distant sound of the herd, and trying to understand the specific quality of wrongness that the evening had taken on. She could not name it. She slept. The sound that woke her was engines. Not one engine. Not two. A multitude. The low, rolling thunder of heavy trucks moving in coordinated formation. The kind of sound that has a military quality to it even when the vehicles making it are not military. When what they are is simply numerous and deliberate and operating before first light. Miriam was at the window before she was fully awake, before she had even consciously decided to move, her body doing what bodies do when they have spent years in a place where the sounds of things arriving matter. The valley was still dark. The fog had thickened overnight. It sat against the property like something solid, like gray wool packed against every surface, and through it moved headlights. Many headlights, coming from the direction of the county road, swinging off onto the track that led to the double V, their beams catching the fence posts and the tree line and the frost on the grass. Miriam counted 14 sets of headlights, 14 vehicles, arranged in a pattern that was not accidental, that spread across the approach to the ranch with a deliberateness that she recognized as tactical, that said, "We are not arriving, we are surrounding." She was dressed and had the shotgun from the cabinet beside the door before the first truck had fully stopped. She did not know yet what she was preparing for. She knew only that she was preparing. She went to the back room. The man, Lyle, she would learn his name eventually, but for now he was still just the man. The silence, the presence that had occupied her barn last night, was already awake. He was sitting on the edge of the cot with his bandaged arm across his knees, and he was looking at the floor with an expression that told her immediately, absolutely, without any words, that he knew exactly what was outside. And he was not surprised. The particular way he was not surprised, the stillness of it, the braced, already reconciled quality of his posture, hit Miriam harder than the headlights had, because she recognized that posture. She had worn it herself, 10 years ago, when she had understood that the police were not going to help her and that the story she was living had a shape she had not chosen and could not easily change. She said, quietly, "Do you know who they are?" He looked at her, nodded once, very slightly, as if even that small motion cost something. She said, "Are they dangerous?" He held her gaze, did not look away, nodded again, and this time there was nothing slight about it. A sound from outside, not the engines now, those had gone quiet, but something else. Boots on gravel, orders given in short, low bursts. The squeak of metal as gates she hadn't locked were pulled open. She heard, somewhere in the middle distance, one of her cattle startle and move, the hollow thudding of their hooves on frozen ground. Miriam went to the side window and looked out carefully, keeping her body angled behind the frame. They were dressed in matching tactical gear, dark gray, no insignia she could immediately identify, but carrying equipment that was far beyond anything a civilian security force had any legitimate need for. Not police, not federal, something that wore the shape of law without actually being law. They moved with the organized precision of people who had done this kind of thing before, who were not nervous about it, who were proceeding through her property at 5:40 in the morning as if her property was simply a terrain feature on a map they had already studied. She counted again. 31 men visible from this window alone. 31. For one man, barely 50, who could not speak, who had eaten her stew and slept on her cot and done nothing. Not one single observable thing to justify this. A sound from the front of the house. 3 heavy knocks against the door. Not a knock of inquiry. A knock of demand. Miriam looked back at the man on the cot. He was looking at the window. His hands had tightened on the edge of the cot frame, and she could see, even across the room, the fine tremor in them that he was working to control. She said, "Stay here." She went to her front door, shotgun in hand, and opened it. Clayton Vance was standing on her porch. She had not seen him in close to 8 months, which had been, by mutual if unspoken agreement, approximately the right amount of time. He was 44 years old, and he had Thomas's height without Thomas's warmth. The same dark hair, the same jaw, but where Thomas's face had opened when he spoke, Clayton's face did the opposite. It collected. It kept. He was wearing the tan uniform of the county sheriff's office with the gold shield of interim sheriff, a position he had held for 3 years since Ray Mulder's retirement, and behind him, arranged at careful intervals along the porch steps and the gravel-turning circle, were 7 of his uniformed men and, beyond them, in the fog, more of the gray uniformed figures from the security force. He looked at the shotgun in her hands. She looked at the 30-some men behind him. He said, "Morning, Miriam." She said, "Clayton." He said he was sorry for the hour. Said it the way people say things they are not sorry for at all, the words performing an emotion the face declines to participate in. He said there was a situation. He said he needed her cooperation. She waited. He told her about the man. He told her his name. Not Lyle, not yet, a different name, a designation more than a name, and said he was an escaped patient from the Blackwood Judicial Psychiatric Facility up in the North County, a dangerous individual with a history of violence, a man who had suffered a complete psychotic break and who had escaped from secure custody 36 hours ago, and who posed, he said, a serious risk to public safety. He told her that a reliable source had placed this man in the vicinity of her property last night. He told her that the Blackwood Security Group, he said this with the flat authority of a term that required no further explanation, was assisting in the recovery effort. And then he told her what he needed from her. He needed to search the house, every room, the barn, the equipment shed, the storage outbuildings, the cellar, the crawl space. He needed her to step aside and permit a full and immediate search of the premises. Miriam looked at him. She said, "Do you have a warrant?" The fog moved. Somewhere behind the tree-line a raven called, once, and was quiet. Clayton's expression did not change. He said that given the emergency nature of the situation, the urgency of apprehending a dangerous individual before he could harm himself or others, a warrant was. He paused, chose his word, redundant. Miriam said, "That is not how warrants work." Clayton said, "Miriam, this is not a negotiation." She said, "Then what is it?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her, into the house, the way people do when they are checking a space and want you to know they are checking it, want you to feel the exposure of it. He said that she had two choices. The first was to permit the search, immediately and without condition, and this would be the end of it. They would find what they came for and leave, and there would be no further consequences for her. The second choice, he said this carefully, with a particular kind of gentleness that was the opposite of gentle, was that she could refuse, and in that case he would have no choice but to place her under arrest for obstruction of justice and criminal harboring of a fugitive. He said that pending the resolution of the case, the county would be obligated to place the Double V in receivership, which would mean the property would be administered by an appointed officer of the court. He let that settle. She understood what he was not saying. The Double V had a mortgage, not a large one. She had paid it down to almost nothing over 22 years of careful management, but enough. Enough that a legal dispute, an administrative freeze on assets, a protracted court proceeding, would create consequences that could not be undone. The ranch was the only thing left, the only structure standing, the only thing Thomas had built that still existed in any form she could reach out and touch. She said, "You would arrest me on my own porch." He said, "I am giving you a chance to make the right decision, Miriam. That is what I am doing." Behind him, one of the security force men had moved to the corner of the porch, close enough that she could see the weapon on his hip, close enough that the message of his presence was entirely clear. She looked at Clayton. She looked at the weapon. She looked at the fog behind him, thick and gray and absolute, and thought about the man in the back room, the trembling hands, the braced posture, the absolute terror of someone who had been found before. She said, "Give me a few minutes to put my dogs inside." Clayton's expression shifted, barely. He said, "You have 5. She went back into the house and closed the door. She moved fast. She went directly to the back room. The man was on his feet. He had been listening. He understood. She could see from his face exactly what had been said and exactly what it meant. He was already looking at her with that particular look, the one that said he had known, had always known, that this would come, and had perhaps allowed himself to briefly forget that while he slept on her cot and ate her stew. She pointed at the floor. She pointed at the specific section of kitchen floor beneath the heavy braided rug, where the pull ring of the old hatch was hidden. The hatch led to the crawl space and from there to the old root cellar, which had been dug before the house itself was built, which was not on any of the county property diagrams because it predated the surveying, and which she had used for decades to store wine and the kind of preserved goods that kept better below the frost line. She pointed at herself, then at the door, then at him, then at the floor. He looked at the hatch, looked at her, looked at the hatch again. Then he nodded, and the look on his face, the look a person has when they understand that someone has chosen them, has put something real at risk for them, a stranger, an unknown, a silence on 2 legs that has offered nothing back, was something Miriam Vance would remember for the rest of her life. She moved the rug. She pulled the ring. The hatch opened on its old, well-oiled hinges, silent. She had kept them oiled for no particular reason except that she kept everything oiled, kept everything in the condition she would need it to be in if the need arose, and the need had apparently, after 58 years, finally arisen. He lowered himself in. She handed him the small battery lantern from the kitchen counter. He took it. She closed the hatch, replaced the rug, moved the kitchen table over the rug. Then she went back to her door, opened it, and said, "All right, Clayton, come in." They went through the house room by room with the systematic aggression of people performing a search for the benefit of an audience that is not watching. They moved quickly, opened things without asking, pulled drawers out, pushed furniture aside, looked under beds, in closets, behind the water heater. They were not gentle. They were not intended to be gentle. The not gentleness was itself a message. Clayton did not participate in the search. He stood in the front room with his hands behind his back and watched Miriam watch his men. And there was something in his watching that she could not name, something that went beyond the transaction of the search, beyond even the authority he was performing. Something that had been present in how he looked at her for years. Something that looked almost like guilt if you pressed on it from exactly the right angle, which she had never quite managed to do. She watched his men. She kept her face neutral. She was very good at keeping her face neutral. One of the men, younger, with pale red hair and the kind of aggressive jawline that comes with early certainty in one's own authority, went to the kitchen. She tracked him carefully from the doorway. He pulled the chairs out, moved the table. The rug was there. He bent, picked up the corner of the rug. Miriam said, without moving. The cellar hatch is there. It has not been used in months. You will find wine and some preserved fruit. The young man looked at her, looked at Clayton. Clayton gave a very slight nod. The young man reached down, pulled the ring. The hatch opened. He shone his flashlight in. Cold air came up, smelling of earth and old wood, and the faint mineral sweetness of the preserved peaches she had jarred in August. She had built an alcove at the far end of the cellar years ago for the wine. It was deep enough, angled correctly, far enough from the hatch opening that the beam of a handheld light did not reach it naturally. The young man shone the beam around. Then he let the hatch fall closed. She breathed. Clayton said, "Satisfied?" She said she would like them to leave now. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Miriam, I want you to understand something. I have known you for 23 years. I am not your enemy." She said nothing. He said, "I am trying to protect you. This man, whoever told you he was safe, whoever gave you the impression that helping him was harmless, they were wrong. He is not what he looks like. He is not well. And the people who are looking for him are not the kind of people who stop." She said, "I do not know what man you are talking about, Clayton." He studied her. She met his eyes and held them. And in the particular quality of that mutual inspection, the two of them standing in the kitchen she had cooked in for 22 years, the kitchen Thomas had built the cabinets for, the kitchen where she had once sat at 3 in the morning waiting for a man who would never come back, something shifted between them. She did not know exactly what she saw, but she saw something. He said, "The search is done. For now." He put a very particular emphasis on those last two words. He gathered his men. He walked out. The security team withdrew to the perimeter. She could still see their vehicles from the window, still parked at intervals along the fence line, still very much present. They had not left. They had simply repositioned. She stood in the kitchen, in the silence after the boots and the moving furniture, and felt the particular quality of being watched by many people who did not want her to know exactly how thoroughly they were watching. She waited 20 minutes. Then she moved the table. Then she lifted the rug. Then she opened the hatch and said, quietly, into the dark below, "It is clear for now, but they are still outside." There was a long pause. Then, from below, the sound of something being knocked against wood. A deliberate sound, repeated. And when she climbed down the short ladder into the cellar and held the lantern up, she found him at the far end, in the alcove, with a piece of charcoal he had taken from the old brazier she kept down there in case the winter got bad enough to need it. He had been writing on the wooden slats of the alcove wall. She was not close enough yet to read it, but she could see that it was a great deal. More than names, more than dates, more than anyone who had been held in silence for a very long time should have been able to produce in the space of 40 minutes. And she thought, he has been composing this for years. In his head, in the dark, waiting for a surface. She did not read it yet. She needed to think. She needed, first, to understand what was happening outside the walls of her house, because whatever was written on those slats would only matter if she was alive and free enough to act on it. She climbed back up, closed the hatch, moved the rug and the table back, and went to the front window. 7 vehicles remained. She counted the men she could see, 12, stationed at points around the perimeter. There would be more she could not see, behind the barn, along the tree line, possibly in the equipment shed. She went to the satellite internet terminal in the back room, an older system, installed by a company out of Billings, that used a dedicated battery backup because power outages in Blackwood Valley were frequent enough that losing connectivity was a real operational problem. The system was running on battery now. She had not even noticed when they had cut the main power to the property, but they had, at some point in the past hour, and the main line was dead. The satellite terminal, however, was not. She sat down at the terminal and opened the interface for the security camera system. She had installed 4 cameras on the property 18 months ago, not for security in any formal sense, but because she had been driving cattle alone and had lost 2 calves to a mountain lion she never saw, and wanted to know when large predators were moving. The cameras were weatherproof, low-light capable, and linked to the same satellite system as the terminal. She opened the live feed and looked at what they were showing her. The cameras saw things her eyes had not. On the north fence, 2 men in gray were speaking into radios at regular intervals, coordinating with someone she couldn't see. Near the barn, a 3rd man had moved the barn door open and was looking inside with a flashlight, which meant the search was continuing. which meant Clayton's search had not been as done as he had implied. Behind the equipment shed, visible only as a heat signature on the camera's infrared mode, a vehicle had been parked sideways, blocking the track that led down toward the south pasture. They were not monitoring. They were closing. The ring of it, the slow, deliberate tightening, had a quality she recognized from something Thomas had said once, years ago, during one of his rare confiding moments. He had been talking about the geology survey that a mining company had commissioned across the valley, talking about it with a flatness that was, she understood now, the flatness of controlled worry. He had said, when a company starts closing a circle around something, it is because they already know what is inside it. She had not known what he meant. She had not pressed him. She had been stupid with love. She opened the camera system settings. There was a function she had explored once and then ignored, a streaming feature that, when enabled, would broadcast the camera feeds live to a public web address. It was a feature intended for farms using the system to allow veterinarians or family members to check on livestock remotely. She had never used it. She had barely thought about it. She turned it on. All 4 cameras. Set the stream to public. Copied the URL into 3 separate email drafts to 3 separate recipients. Her attorney and Helena, a journalist in Missoula whose card she had kept for no reason she could now articulate, and her daughter in Portland, who called on Sundays and who would not understand what she was looking at, but who was resourceful enough to find someone who would. She set the emails to send in 3 hours on a delayed timer, long enough for the situation to develop, short enough that if things went very badly, the record would still go out. Then she went back downstairs. He was still at the wall. The charcoal words filled 3 slats now. She had to hold the lantern close and move it slowly to read the whole of it. She read. She stood in the root cellar beneath her kitchen, in the cold and the dark, with the smell of earth and old wood around her, and she read what Lyle had written on the wall. And she understood. Thomas had found something. In the weeks before he disappeared, Thomas Vance had been contacted by a geologist he trusted, a man named Gareth, who had worked for the mining consortium that held exploration rights in the northern sector of the valley. Gareth had sent Thomas a set of survey results, not the official results, not the ones the company filed with the county, but the real ones, the unredacted ones, which showed with great precision what lay beneath 1,100 acres of the Double V Ranch. Rare earth elements. A substantial deposit. The kind of find that, in a market increasingly desperate for materials to build batteries and electronics and military hardware, was worth an almost incomprehensible amount of money. Worth enough to change the shape of a county. Worth enough to make 1,100 acres of Montana ranchland worth more than the people living on it. Thomas had come to understand what this meant. He had tried to understand who knew. And the man he had found, eventually, through a set of connections she had not known existed, the man who could confirm it, who could tell him the shape of what was being planned, was Lyle. Lyle had been the accounting manager for the Blackwood Mining Consortium for 11 years. He had managed the books that contained, beneath layers of corporate structure and shell company misdirection, the real story of what the consortium knew and what they intended. He had, at some point. She could not read the exact timeline from the charcoal. The space was too compressed, but she understood the shape of it, tried to act on what he knew, had prepared to document it, had reached out to the wrong person in the wrong sequence, and had been picked up by the consortium's security people before he could reach anyone who would have helped him. He had been held for 10 years. Not in a state facility. Not in any place with legal standing. In a property the consortium owned through intermediaries, in the hills north of the county, under conditions that were designed to degrade his credibility, to make him seem, if he ever emerged, like a man whose mind had not survived the experience. Clayton Vance had arranged it. Clayton, who had no love for his brother and who had been on the consortium's payroll since before Thomas disappeared. Clayton, who had told Thomas the survey results were public and harmless and that he was worrying over nothing. Clayton, who had arranged, and here Lyle's handwriting became smaller, more compressed, as if the act of writing it cost him something different from the rest, for Thomas to be driven out to the north section of the property, under the pretext of a fence problem, and to be met there by 2 consortium men. They had not meant for it to happen the way it happened, Lyle had written. They had meant to frighten him, to take his papers and frighten him. But Thomas had fought. Thomas had fought hard, the way stubborn men who love something fight when they understand it is being taken. And the outcome was what frightened men produce when they feel exposed. He was buried in the north section. Lal had written the coordinates. Miriam sat on the bottom step of the ladder with the lantern in her lap and the words in the cold air above her and could not, for a long moment, do anything at all. She had known. She had always known, in the way the body knows things before the mind is willing to confirm them, that Thomas had not left, had not packed a bag and walked out the door of a life he had built for 20 years. She had known it the way she knew weather coming in off the mountains, not from any single signal, but from the accumulated pressure of everything that did not fit the official explanation. She had also, in the darkest places she could barely look at directly, blamed herself for the distance between them in those final months, for the questions she had not pressed, for the stubborn self-sufficiency that had kept her from making him feel he could come to her with something terrifying, that he had to handle it alone, that she would only add it to the list of things that needed managing and not to the list of things she needed to know about, because she loved him and loved him and loved him and had never said it enough in those last months, because she had assumed they had more months, more years, more ordinary cold mornings with coffee and boots on the porch. She sat in the root cellar and let that grief move through her for exactly as long as she could afford to let it, which was not long. Lal was watching her from the alcove. He had finished writing and was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his bandaged arm across his knees. And he was watching her read with the particular attention of a man who has been waiting 10 years to have something he carries finally received by someone who can hold it. She looked at him. She said, "He was looking for you. My husband was looking for you." He nodded. She said, "He died because of what you know." He held her eyes, nodded again, slowly, and there was in his face something she recognized from the mirror. The expression of a person who carries the weight of what their knowledge cost, who has been sitting in the dark with it for a very long time, and who does not know how to put it down. She said, "I need to ask you something." He waited. She said, "If I get you out, if we get through this, can you testify? Can you write it down, legally, in a form that will hold?" He looked at his hands. She could see him thinking, not about whether he would, but about whether he could, about what the act of doing that would require from a man who had spent a decade being systematically reduced, who had been made to feel that his knowledge was powerless, that his voice had already been silenced before he could use it. Then he looked at the wall, at the words he had written in charcoal in the cold dark under the kitchen of a woman he had never met, on the property above which the man who had tried to reach him was buried. He looked back at her, and he nodded. She climbed back up. The dilemma sat in her chest with a physical weight. She was alone, with no electricity, with 30-some armed men around her property, with a recording system that might or might not be visible to people who might or might not act in time. She had a shotgun, a satellite terminal, a battery backup, and the testimony of a man who was officially recorded as a violent psychiatric patient. Against them, an interim county sheriff, a private security force with military equipment, a decade of institutional cover, and the willingness to do what they had already done. The choice was simple. The choice was impossible. She went to the safe in the bedroom, opened it, and took out Thomas's shotgun, a Browning over-under that she had not touched since he disappeared, that she had kept oiled and loaded because Thomas would have kept it oiled and loaded, and because some part of her had understood, on some operational level that had no language for itself, that the day might come when she would need it. She broke it open, checked the chambers. Then she looked out the window at the fog and the headlights and the men with their radios, and she said to herself, very quietly, the way Thomas used to say things when he had made up his mind, "All right then." It was Clayton who found the hatch. She had underestimated him. She had been a fool to underestimate him. He had been on this property dozens of times over 2 decades, had walked through this kitchen, had eaten at this table, and he was not stupid. He was many things, and none of them were good, but he was not stupid. He came back through the front door without knocking. The lock had been broken in the first search, with 2 men behind him and his hand already on the weapon at his hip. He looked at the floor. He looked at the table. He looked at the particular way the rug was not quite flat at the edges, the way a rug is not flat when it has been moved and replaced in a hurry. He said, "Move the table, Miriam." She said, "Clayton." He said, "Move it now, or I will." She moved it. He looked at the ring in the floor. He looked at her. His face was very still. He said, "Step back." She stepped back. He signaled to one of the men behind him, who reached down and pulled the hatch open. Cold air came up. The 2 men went in with their flashlights. She heard them moving through the cellar, heard the moment one of them found the alcove. She heard, "He is here. I have him." Clayton did not look at her when they brought Lyle up. He kept his eyes on Lyle with an expression she could not entirely name. Something between relief and calculation and a third thing. Something older, something that might have been, in someone with different architecture, something like shame. Lyle emerged from the hatch white-faced, blinking, one of the security men's hands tied on his arm. He was still. Not a passive stillness. A chosen stillness. The stillness of someone who has learned that resistance at the wrong moment costs everything. Clayton said, "We are going to take a short walk, all of us." "Outside." Miriam said, "He is not well. His wound." Clayton said, "Outside, Miriam." They walked out the back door, across the rear porch, into the fog and the cold. 2 more security men joined them from the shadows near the barn. There were 6 of them now, plus Clayton, plus Miriam, plus Lyle, standing in the gray morning behind the house, where the irrigation system's main valve was 15 feet to her left, where the metal panel she had installed last fall was within reach if she could get to it, where everything she had set up and the one decision she had made last night that might have been more than stubbornness were either going to matter or not. Clayton said, "Lyle, you know what happens next?" Lyle looked at him, said nothing. His face said, "I have always known." Clayton said, "This can be clean. That is the only choice I can offer you." He had not drawn his weapon yet. He would. She could see it in the way his shoulder was positioned, in the slight forward shift of his weight. She said, "Clayton." He looked at her. She said, "The cameras have been streaming for the last 2 hours. The fog sat against them." He said, "What?" She said, "Every camera on this property. Live. Public feed. The URL has been in 3 people's inboxes since 5 this morning. Your face. Your men's faces. The vehicles. The uniforms. All of it." Something moved through Clayton's face. The particular kind of movement that belongs to a person who is recalculating very quickly, who is discovering that the shape of the situation is not the shape they thought it was. He said, "That is not possible." "The power." She said, "Satellite backup battery. Thomas installed it." He was a thorough man, Clayton. She moved. Not toward him. Toward the irrigation panel. She covered the 15 feet in the time it took him to process and react, which was just barely enough time, and she hit the main valve with the flat of her hand and the high-pressure irrigation system for the south yard. The one she had pressurized the previous night for the morning run. The one that was pointed not at the lawn but at the approach to the porch, at the gravel and the clay soil that held water badly and pooled immediately. Released. The effect was not cinematic in the way that films make things cinematic. It was immediate, practical, and very messy. 100 gallons per minute of cold water hitting freezing clay produces mud, fast. The yard became treacherous in seconds. 2 of the security men went down. The fog caught the mist from the irrigation and turned it into a wall of gray-white vapor. Miriam turned with Thomas's shotgun, already raised, and pointed it at Clayton Vance from 10 feet away. She said, "Put it down." He had the weapon in his hand, drawn in the second of her movement. They looked at each other across the cold and the mud and the mist. He said, "You are making a mistake." She said, "I have been making mistakes for 10 years. This is not one of them." Her hands were steady. She was surprised by how steady they were. He said, "You do not know what you are doing." She said, "I know exactly where my husband is buried, Clayton. I know the coordinates." Lyle wrote them on the wall. The second she said it, she saw what she had been watching for in his face for 23 years, the fracture. Not guilt exactly, though there was guilt in it. The fracture of a person whose entire structure of rationalizations, the 10 years of it, the elaborate architecture of deciding Thomas had left, and Lyle was dangerous and Miriam was a grieving woman with a grudge, meeting the specific, concrete weight of reality. He lowered the weapon. The 6 security men did not lower their weapons immediately. For a very long moment, the situation existed in the specific kind of suspension that belongs to standoffs. The mutual assessment, the calculation, the invisible arithmetic of what each person in the scene is willing to do and what they estimate everyone else is willing to do. Miriam kept the shotgun on Clayton. She said, without looking away from him, "Lyle, go back inside. Go to the front of the house." She heard him move, heard the back door, then nothing. The youngest of the security men, the red-haired one from the earlier search, began moving his weapon toward a new angle. She clocked it in her peripheral vision. She said, "I would like to remind everyone that this has been streaming publicly for 2 hours." She said it flatly, as a fact, without emphasis, the way you state something that requires no inflection because the words carry their own weight. The red-haired man stopped moving. Clayton said something she could not fully hear to the men around him. A low word, a signal, she was not sure which. Two of them stepped back. The others held their positions, but their posture changed. That specific change that happens when armed people understand that the arithmetic has shifted against them. From inside the house, she heard Lyle. Not his voice, he had no voice, not for anything conversational, but a sound, a tapping, rhythmic, purposeful, against the window frame of the front room. Fast and deliberate. She did not know what it meant. She kept her eyes on Clayton. Then, from the direction of the county road, 8 miles, but carried by the cold and the flat acoustics of the fog, a sound she had heard very few times in her life, but recognized completely: sirens. Multiple sirens, not the intermittent whoop of a county vehicle doing a routine response, but the sustained, continuous, multi-vehicle sound of people coming fast with intention. Clayton heard it too. His face did the thing she had watched for, the final settling, the last calculation, the acceptance of a particular outcome that had, she now understood, always been possible if a single thing had gone differently. If one person had chosen differently. If one woman had simply not opened her barn door in the fog. He looked at her. He said, "I did not mean for Thomas to die." She said, "I know." He said, "It was never." She said, "Clayton, put the weapon on the ground." He looked at her for a long time. She let him look. She was patient. She had been patient for 10 years. She could be patient for another 30 seconds while a man assembled himself for something he had been avoiding for a long time. He put the weapon on the ground. Then, very slowly, with a deliberateness that she understood was its own kind of dignity, the last version of it available to him, he put his hands behind his head. The sirens took 12 minutes to become vehicles, and the vehicles took another 3 minutes to sort themselves out along the approach and confirm the situation and organize themselves with the specific controlled energy of state law enforcement arriving at a scene that is more complicated than the dispatch call described. She put down the shotgun when the first state patrol car pulled into the turning circle. She put it down carefully, pointed away, in the deliberate way of someone communicating clearly, and she stood with her hands visible while the first 2 officers came forward. She said, "The man you are looking for is inside." She said, "The man with the weapons is there." She said, "The recording system is active. There are 4 cameras. You will want the footage." They sorted the rest of it without her, for the most part. There was a period of controlled chaos, more vehicles arriving, the security men being separated and managed, Clayton being placed in restraints with an expression on his face that she watched for a long moment before she made herself look away. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been carrying something extremely heavy for a very long time and had finally been permitted to set it down, even if what waited on the other side of setting it down was worse than the carrying. She went inside. Lyle was in the front room, sitting on the sofa, with a wool blanket around his shoulders that he had found himself. He looked at her when she came in. She sat in the chair across from him. She said, "They are here. It is over. Or the beginning of the over." He looked at her. His face did that thing again. The thing from last night on the porch, when she had set down the stew and the coffee. Something that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief and was more than both of those things. She thought about what he had written on the wall. About Thomas. About the North Section. About the coordinates written in charcoal that she would give to the State Patrol within the hour, and which would begin a process that would eventually, after weeks and months of the patient, grinding mechanics of investigation and excavation, bring her husband home. Not alive. She had known for years he was not alive. But home. Knowable. Real. No longer a man who left. She had spent 10 years carrying 2 separate weights. The grief of losing Thomas, and the corrosive, deeper weight of not knowing, of living in a story that said he chose to leave her, of building her entire remaining life on ground that felt, at every step, like it might give way beneath her because she could never be certain what it was built on. The uncertainty was finished. Thomas had not left. Thomas had fought for this land, for her, for the truth, had fought with the stubbornness that she recognized because she had loved him for it, and had found it infuriating in equal measure, and had lost. Not because he was wrong, Because the people who came for him had more men and more willingness, and because the world is sometimes simply unfair in the specific way that well-organized greed is unfair. But he had tried to reach Lyle. He had tried to get to the truth. He had tried, in his quiet, methodical way, to protect her. She looked at the watch on Lyle's wrist. She had seen it last night and had not recognized it immediately, but now, in the morning light, with the front room sorted and the chaos outside settling toward procedure, she could see it clearly. It was Thomas's father's pocket watch, converted to a wristwatch sometime in the 60s. She had given it to Thomas on their 20th anniversary. The crystal was cracked now, and the leather of the band had been replaced with something rougher, improvised. She said, "He gave that to you." Lyle looked at the watch, nodded. She said, "When?" He held up a finger, "Wait," and then pointed at the wall, and she understood he meant the wall in the cellar, the writing. Later, she read, "He came to me the night before they took him. He found where they were keeping me. He could not get me out. There were too many, but he came to the window. He put the watch through the bars. He told me to survive. He did not say it in words, but I understood." She folded the paper, put it in her pocket, let it sit against her ribs. She said, to the empty room, to no one, to a man who had been dead for 10 years and whose ghost had been the dominant presence in every room of this house for all of them, "I know. I am sorry it took so long. I know." The State Patrol senior detective, a woman named Reeves, compact and precise, with the particular calm of someone who has seen complicated things and has learned not to be surprised by them, sat across from Miriam at the kitchen table and told her that the situation was going to take time. She said it respectfully and directly, and Miriam appreciated both. Time meant the investigation, the excavation, the court proceedings, the dismantling of what the consortium and the Blackwood Security Group had built over 15 years of careful, patient corruption. Time meant Lyle, whom Reeves confirmed had no psychiatric file that matched the description Clayton had given, whose commitment to the judicial facility was a fabrication, whose paperwork had been manufactured by people who had access to both the county administrative system and to a sheriff who was willing to provide whatever documentation was needed, would need to testify, would need to be medically evaluated, would need to be somewhere protected while the case developed. Time meant that the ranch would be a crime scene for the foreseeable future, at least in its northern section. Time meant lawyers and depositions, and the kind of prolonged institutional attention that Miriam had spent 20 years structuring her life to avoid. She said, "I understand." Reeves said, "There is one more thing." She said, "I am listening." Reeves told her about the stream. The 4 cameras, live, streaming public, had been seen by more people than Miriam's 3 email recipients. The journalist in Missoula had picked it up within 40 minutes of the stream going live and had begun amplifying it. By the time the State Patrol had responded and arrived, the footage had been shared widely enough that Reeves had received 2 calls from federal agencies in the 90-minute drive to the ranch. She said, "You understand what this means." Miriam said that it is very difficult to undo. Reeves said, "Yes. This was, in fact, the problem. The visibility that had protected Lyle and exposed Clayton was now a lens that the ranch, the valley, the entire situation would be viewed through indefinitely. Miriam's property, her life, her grief, all of it was now, to some degree, public in a way that could not be unpublicized." She sat with it. She thought about it. Then she said, "He was buried in quiet. He was hidden in quiet. The whole of it was kept alive by quiet. I think I can tolerate some noise." Reeves looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and stood up, and went back outside. Miriam stayed at the kitchen table. She looked at the floor where the hatch was. At the table she had moved. At the rug that was slightly crooked and which she would straighten later, when there was time, when the men with their equipment and their questions had finished with her kitchen and left her alone with it. She put her hands flat on the table, felt the wood, felt the familiar roughness of it, the grain she had cleaned 1,000 times. She said, very quietly, "Okay." They found Thomas 6 days later. The coordinates Lyle had written in charcoal on the root cellar wall were precise to within 3 feet. The excavation team from the state worked carefully and professionally, and with a quietness she was grateful for. And when they came to the house on the evening of the 6th day to tell her, Reeves came herself, which Miriam also appreciated. She did not go to the site. She had thought she would want to. She did not. She went instead to the north fence line the following morning, alone, At the same time, she would have been doing her morning rounds. In the fog that still came early at this time of year, and still sat low across the valley in the particular way it had for as long as she had been here. And she stood at the fence and looked north toward the pines and said whatever needed to be said without any words at all. She stood there for a long time. Then she went back to the house and made coffee. The investigation moved with the speed that large investigations move, which is to say slowly and with great institutional noise. The consortium's operations were suspended pending federal review. 3 board members were indicted. Clayton Vance, who had entered a formal arrest processing with the expression of a man who had finally set something down, retained a lawyer, and then, 2 weeks later, changed his mind and called Reeves directly and said he wanted to talk. What he said filled 47 pages of transcribed testimony and was characterized by the lead prosecutor as the most comprehensive voluntary admission of institutional corruption she had seen in 20 years of practice. Miriam did not read the 47 pages. She did not need to. She had the version written in charcoal on the wall of her root cellar, which she had carefully photographed and then preserved with a coat of clear sealant, because it was the original version, and the original version mattered. Lyle spent 2 weeks in a medical facility in Helena, where he was evaluated by people who confirmed what everyone already understood, that he was not and had not been psychotic, that his refusal to speak was a protective response to prolonged trauma, that with appropriate support his voice, the physical mechanism of it, would return. He had been kept silent by circumstance and fear, not by any failure of his mind. He returned to the Double V at his own request in mid-November. Miriam had not expected that. She had given him the number of the facility, had said he was welcome, had not assumed he would come. When his truck, a borrowed one, an old Ford that coughed smoke and needed work, came up the gravel track on a Tuesday morning, she was on the porch with her coffee and watched it arrive with the particular feeling of something completing a circuit. He got out. He looked at the house. He looked at her. She said, "I have stew on." He said, "Good." His voice was rough with disuse. Quiet, careful around the edges. "But there." She nodded. He nodded back. They went inside. She fed him stew and coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table in the same silence they had first shared, but a different silence now, a silence that had been cleared of its weight, like a room after the furniture has been rearranged and you can finally see the floor. He would testify. He would testify comprehensively, methodically, with the precision of a man who had spent 10 years organizing his memory against exactly this purpose. His testimony, combined with the camera footage, combined with Clayton's 47 pages, combined with the physical evidence at the excavation site, would form the foundation of a prosecution that federal attorneys described privately to each other as airtight. None of that happened quickly. None of it happened without cost. Miriam lost parts of the North Field to the excavation process. She lost 2 months of normal operations to the investigation's logistics. She lost, in some indefinable way, the particular quietness of the Double V, the way it had been hers alone, sealed, unknown, slightly ghostly. People knew it now. The valley knew it. The cameras had been shared and saved and would be shared and saved again. And the story of a woman and a fog and a barn and a silence was out in the world in a form that would not come back. She found she did not mind it as much as she had expected. In late November, on a morning when the valley was white and still and the first real snow of the season had settled across the hillside, she stood on the rebuilt porch. The security team had broken 2 boards. She had replaced them, better boards, properly sealed, and watched the light come up. It came up slowly. It always did, in Blackwood Valley, in November, when the mountains to the west held the night in longer than it had any right to stay. The sky moved through gray and pale gray and something that was not quite blue, and then the actual blue of a winter morning at altitude, and then the first direct light hit the frost on the grass and made the field look briefly, absolutely, like something new. Lyle came out with 2 mugs of coffee. He had, over the preceding weeks, quietly and without discussion, begun making himself useful. He was not a rancher, had never been, but he had certain methodical inclinations, certain organizational instincts, that translated. He had reorganized the equipment shed in a way that made things findable. He had, without being asked, researched the land rights situation regarding the mineral deposits and had produced, in his now daily writing, a summary of what legal options existed for the registered landowner of the Double V. She had read it twice and then called her attorney in Helena and read it to her. And her attorney had been quiet for a long time and then had said, "Where did this come from?" She had said, "A very thorough man who has had a great deal of time to think." Lal set the mug on the porch railing beside her. She said, "Thank you." He made a small sound. Agreement, acknowledgement, something in between. She held the mug in both hands and looked at the light on the frost, and she thought about the word silencio, not the English word, but the Portuguese one she had learned from a ranch hand years ago, who had said that in Portuguese the word for silence was heavier than in English, more bodied, more present, like a thing that occupied space rather than simply described the absence of noise. She thought, 10 years of that. 10 years of a silence that had occupied every room, every morning, every ordinary task done alone. The silence of not knowing. The silence of a story that did not fit. The silence of a community that had chosen an explanation over a truth because explanations are cleaner. And then, a stranger in a barn. A bowl of stew. A mug of coffee with sugar because she had not known how he took it. And all of it, the 10 years, the buried truth, the man who fought for her, the man who survived for exactly this purpose. All of it had been waiting behind that single ordinary act of opening a barn door in the fog and choosing not to look away. She said, not to Lyle exactly, not to anyone exactly. He tried to tell me. The whole time. He was here. I just did not know where to look. Lyle was quiet beside her. The light moved across the valley, slow and certain, the way light moves when it has nowhere else to be. She drank her coffee. The pines were absolutely still. The frost on the grass was turning to water at the edges, and the water was catching the light, and for a moment the whole south field shone. Miriam Vance stood on the porch of the house she had built her life around and breathed the cold air of a Montana morning and felt, for the first time in 10 years, that the ground beneath her feet was solid. Not because everything was resolved, not because the loss had been returned to her, not because the past 10 years had been repaid or balanced or made fair, because they had not been and would not be, but because she knew. Because one silent man in a barn had been fed and kept and protected, and in return he had given her the one thing no amount of stubbornness or patience or endurance had been able to provide: the truth, written in charcoal in the dark, waiting for her to climb down and read it. The valley filled with light. It filled slowly, and then all at once, the way valleys do, the way some things do, slowly for years, and then completely, in a single morning, so that when you look at them you can no longer quite remember what the dark looked like. If this story stayed with you, if Miriam's courage, Lyle's silence, and the truth that waited 10 years in the dark touched something real, then you already know what these stories are about. They are about the choices no one sees. The small acts of compassion that happen in fog and cold and ordinary evenings, with no witnesses and no guarantee that they will matter. They always matter. Drop your city in the comments. Tell us you were here for this one. Leave a like if Miriam's story moved you. And subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter we tell together. And if you know someone who is carrying a 10-year silence of their own, forward this to them. Sometimes the most important thing a person can hear is simply this: the truth has not gone anywhere. It is waiting. And one small act of courage is still enough to bring it home. We will see you in the next one.